Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs for CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Today, we'll discuss the kinds of border-spanning challenges that artificial intelligence poses and the means by which they can be addressed via multinational consensus. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, please put something in the chat and a CSET staffer will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. And now it's time to turn the mic over to our moderator, CSET Executive Director Dewey Murdick. Dewey serves as an unpaid advisor to several organizations, the OECD Network of Experts on AI, or One AI, the Global Partnership on AI Data Governance Working Group, the Center for a New American Security Task Force on AI and National Security, and CEMIA, where he is a member of the Board of Directors. Prior to joining CSET as its founding Director of Data Science, Dewey was Director of Science Analytics at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, where he led metric development, data science, and machine learning, and statistical research for science-facing products and science-related initiatives. Dewey served as Chief Analytics Officer and Deputy Chief Scientist with the Department of Homeland Security. At the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, or IARPA, he co-founded an office in anticipatory intelligence and led programs in high-risk, high-payoff research in support of national security missions. He's also held positions in intelligence analysis, research, software development, and contract teaching. Dewey, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Good morning, good afternoon, and even good evening in some cases. It's really nice to have you with us. My name is Dewey, as Lynn just introduced me, and I direct CSET. I was originally trained as a computational physicist, but really fell in love with decision support and policy analysis, particularly at the intersection of emerging technology, public policy, and security. And as part of this analysis and work, I really got to see how important multi-party and international discussions were to helping achieve goals in economic security, consumer safety, and the well-being and sustainability of humankind in general. Today, we're going to hear a little bit more about these topics, and you'll see how this context can allow you to have make progress between countries in ways that unilateral or even corporate action cannot achieve on their own. You often need countries to work together to help manage the way through these complex issues. In this journey, it's been a real pleasure to have the opportunity to work with experts and leaders from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. Today, we're going to learn more about this multi-party environment and how it relates to a very important emerging technology known as artificial intelligence from some key leaders at OECD. AI has the potential to reshape how countries execute their executive, legislative, and judicial governing power, how they work together, how individuals make a living, or even how they express their human experience in art and writing. OECD's AI principles were adopted in May 2019. Since then, OECD's member countries have focused on finding ways to practically implement these principles, to better characterize AI systems and their risk, and help ensure responsible business due diligence evaluations are being performed for AI systems, and much more. I really want to take the opportunity to thank Audrey Plonk and Karine Perset for joining us today to share with our audience some of the insights that they're seeing, some of the work that's ongoing, and to answer some of your questions. Before I start, I'd like to introduce Audrey and Karine. Karine is head of the AI unit of OECD's Division for Digital Economy Policy. She is responsible for the quite nifty OECD AI Policy Observatory. She manages OECD's network of experts. Some of that, as being a member there, we can get unruly sometimes, so it's really appreciate you keeping us on target. Karine works to ensure that OECD AI principles are implemented in ways that are effective, pursue opportunities, and acknowledge risk and challenges on the way. She previously was an advisor to ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee, the folks that manage the name and numerical spaces for the internet, and was a counselor of the OECD's Science, Technology, and Innovation Directors. If you listen very carefully, you might be able to hear remnants of her Minnesotan accent mixed in with the French. So thank you so much, Karine, for joining us. I'd also like to do at this time to introduce Audrey Plonk. She leads the Digital Economy Policy Division for the Director of Science, Technology, and Innovation at OECD. In this role, she manages the Digital Economy Division, provides strategic input, and works to make the Secretary General's strategic objectives a reality. She's also responsible for implementing a program of work for the Committee on Digital Economy and Policy and the Committee for Consumer Policy. Prior to joining OECD, Audrey worked in a variety of positions in the Intel Corporation, including Senior Director for Global Security Policy, Senior Director for Public Policy, and she specialized in China cyber policy and advised Intel businesses and product teams on China strategy. She was also a consultant at the Department of Homeland Security, National Cybersecurity Division. She has a wealth of other experiences. She served on board, she's led nonprofits, and she's also been a guest lecturer at UC Berkeley, where she taught cybersecurity coursework. Please join me in welcoming Audrey and Karine to CSET's virtual stage. Over to you.
Thanks, Dewey, for that really kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. As we said, my name is Audrey Plonk. I'm the head of the Digital Economy Policy Division here at the OECD, and Karine and I are going to walk you through a bit of the work that the OECD does in the area of artificial intelligence, but also a little bit about the OECD more broadly and how we do our work here. We should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, and so we've structured our presentation to allow for that. So I'll go ahead and dive in about starting a little bit about what we're going to cover. The first is, what is the OECD? I'll give you a little bit of background there. We'll talk about the OECD's AI principles, which Dewey already introduced a bit of. We'll talk about international cooperation to help implement those principles. And then Karine will talk a little bit more in detail about what we're doing specifically in our AI work to maximize the benefits of AI, to advise governments on policymaking, and then to manage AI risks. So just starting off, for those who are not familiar with the OECD, many of you may be, the OECD has a rich history that dates back to the end of the Second World War, where the roots of the OECD come from the Marshall Plan, the distribution of economic aid to the rebuilding of Europe that eventually led to the creation of the OECD in 1960. You can see a picture there from the signing of the agreement that created the OECD in December of 1960. And it really is an organization that's focused on gathering data, putting evidence behind policy recommendations, and ultimately bringing countries together to shape international policy, write standards, and ultimately improve citizens' experiences and lives around the world. One unique thing about the OECD is we cover almost all policy areas in an economy under one house, or under one roof, as we say here, even though we have multiple buildings. And this really allows integrated multidisciplinary approaches to key policy challenges, from education to trade to digital. So for those who aren't familiar, there may be a few historic examples where the OECD has played an important role in the international space. One is the Anti-Bribery Convention, which you may be familiar with. Recently, the tax agreement on a global minimum digital tax. We also have the 1980 privacy guidelines, and have done things like the polluter pays principle long before climate discussions were what they are today. So for the last 6 years, really, the OECD has brought countries together to standardize approaches to policy action that will allow our economies to grow and thrive. And that's certainly the case in technology. So we are comprised of 38 member countries and work with over 100 total. We represent, as an economic bloc, 80% of world trade and investment. We put on about 4,000 conferences a year, although I think that number might be moving a bit with all the virtual ones that we've been doing since COVID. We have more than 5 billion data points. A big part of what we do, and you'll see from our presentation, particularly on AI, is bring together bring data into the OECD, analyze that data, and use it to provide policy insights to our constituents. We produce overall as an organization about 500 major reports a year, and we engage in international standards development. So what does that mean for digital? A few key areas that we operate in. One is data collection and analysis, and we'll show you some of the data from the AI Policy Observatory, but we also collect data on a range of different aspects of digital transformation. You can go to our Going Digital Toolkit and look across the range of metrics and indicators that we have for understanding how countries are transforming in the digital space. We also measure broadband penetration, uptake, use, and that's just a couple examples from my division. We obviously do discussion and consultation. I'm sure there's some people listening who were at our ministerial last month, and one important role the OECD plays on a variety of topics is to convene people to discuss important topics and to move agendas forward. As I said, we do standard setting and policy guidance in the area of digital. There's a wealth of instruments that we are responsible for, including the AI principles, but not exclusively. We have cybersecurity recommendations, we have privacy guidelines, we have a new declaration on government access to data for law enforcement and national security purposes. So these are all what we think of as policy guidance and standards that our countries adopt, and then are soft law and used as a commitment and a political commitment to implement in their environments. And then we support the implementation of the guidance that we make. So it's great to have guidance. It's better to have implementation of the guidance. And so we strive in all the areas that we work to develop implementation support. And you'll hear a lot about that today on the AI side. And then another thing we do is we sometimes dive deep into countries' experiences and do in-depth reviews of a country's regulatory or policy environment in particular areas. And so, for example, we've looked at Brazil's digitalization strategies. We have a long history of looking at connectivity and broadband regulatory approaches and advising countries on changing that. So a breadth of work, and this is really in some ways just a very small sample of what we have over here at the OECD on digital. But we're here really to talk about AI today. What the foundation of our AI work actually predates the principles themselves, with analytical work that Karine undertook several years before the principles came about. But the principles themselves, which you probably have all heard about and are a bit familiar with, were really the first intergovernmental instrument of their kind. They were adopted in May, and they are not probably surprising in 2023 today, but starting back in 2016, 2017, 2018, looking at this, we were sort of early in being able to put these concepts down on papers and get governments to agree to them. They were also welcomed at the G20 in 2019, led by Japan. So they're the foundation of a lot of the work that you're going to hear about today, and the way that we think about building AI systems, governing AI systems, and putting risk management in place around those systems. So the principles themselves are comprised of two different pieces. The first piece is what we call the values-based principles. So they'll talk about all the things you would expect about the AI benefiting people on the planet, about the focus on human rights and fairness, transparency and explainability, that the systems be robust, secure, and safe, and that there be accountability in their development and deployment. And then there's 5 principles that are focused on advice to governments around national policies and how to build enabling ecosystems so that AI can develop and grow and really bring good to our societies and economies. And those focus on policies around research and development, how to use data, building compute capacity and using technology, looking at policy and a regulatory environment that's favorable, that embraces new and emerging technologies while also understanding the risks and managing those risks, that takes jobs and skills and labor transitions into account, and that ultimately underpins all of that with international cooperation and measurement. So that's what the principles say. And I think while, again, in 2023, we might not think of any of these as particularly new or groundbreaking. At the time, putting them down on paper was new. And I think what you'll see that we've done behind them to support countries' implementation of them is quite unique. You can see here the countries that have adopted the AI principles. Obviously, the dark blue is the OECD members. Non-members have the ability to adhere to our instruments. And so in the kind of medium blue, you can see countries that have adhered voluntarily. And then you can see the G20 countries that have recognized the principles in their context. So part of the reason we like to talk about that is just to show the value in trying to harmonize concepts and as baselines as we develop policy and regulations in emerging technology areas. So how do we do this? I won't bother you too much with OECD bureaucracy, but just to say, we have an amazing group of experts that Dewey and many others around the world are part of as our multi-stakeholder OECD AI Network of Experts that's broken into 4 different groups that really is the engine, a lot of the engine behind our work. And one of the value propositions of the OECD beyond having, being able to look at an entire economy under one roof is being able to work in a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary way. And so this is a group of people that is comprised of our member countries, but of academics and of industry and of civil society and labor and a wide variety of thought leaders and technical folks working on AI around the world. We have now an official body in the OECD made up of representatives focused on AI. That's called our Working Party on AI Governance, and that came after the principles to sort of be the home for the work that you're going to hear about. The last thing I'll mention, and if you're multitasking and already in a web browser, you might want to go ahead and go to OECD.ai and look at the Policy Observatory if you haven't. It's the main platform by which we are communicating and sharing what's happening in the world of AI. So that's an incredible resource both to our countries as well as to a much broader research and policy community. The observatory really was the brainchild of Karine, and I'm sure she'll say more about it, but it was one of the first things I got to be part of when I joined the OECD at the end of 2019. And it was like the last thing we launched before everything shut down before COVID. And but what it does is it provides it provides a view into trends of what's happening in AI, everything from research collaboration across countries to patents to jobs and labor issues, where skills being demanded. So it looks at a range of issues. It also provides a repository of national strategies and country approaches to AI, which is another area where the OECD focuses. And so a lot of these projects connect specifically to our principles. And so again, the principles are great, but the implementation of them is where things can often get challenging. And so you can see here that, and I won't go through all of this, but just to give some examples of some things that we have going on to sort of take the concept of how do you enable R&D in an environment, or how do you enable R&D policy to help AI grow. Some of the projects we have associated with that recommendation. And so what you'll hear, and I expect this audience is quite interested in, is how we're on the values principles, the other 5 principles, how we're putting practical tools in place to help countries implement them. Here's just a quick snapshot of the dashboard on the observatory. As I said, it's a live repository. It has over 700 AI policy initiatives from over 60 countries, territories, and the European Union. There's live data. It looks a little bit like this. Hopefully, you guys have good enough bandwidth that you can see some of the live charts where we're measuring things like on the left-hand side, AI publications versus GDP per capita by country and region over time. So on the on the x-axis, you've got time, and you can see the countries, US, the EU 27, and China moving into the publication space. You can see this is really just a snapshot, but the down here on the right hand corner in the bottom is the news feed that's ever changing around AI. And so we're constantly adding and updating and putting new features and getting new data sets and cleaning new data sets and trying to build out a picture for our countries, and it's open source, so it's available to everybody, of what's happening in the AI space. So I really encourage you to play around with that. There's a lot of really interesting stuff. And then with that, I'm going to turn to Karine to dive a little bit more into some of the projects specifically that you're likely interested in.
Thanks a lot, Audrey. So I'll dive into, Audrey mentioned the first 5 OECD principles that are basically values that AI systems should reflect and rights that should be protected. And so this slide tries to show, in a nutshell, how different work streams on trustworthy AI relate and contribute to the larger global efforts. And so I'll walk us through the four pillars one by one. But in a few words, over the past couple of years, maybe even a little bit more, we have seen convergence everywhere towards adapting AI policy to the risk that different AI systems pose. And that's also the approach that we took in the 2019 OECD AI Principles. So in the same vein, I'll structure these points around the 4 standard risk management stages of first defining the AI risk context that we're talking about, second, assessing AI risk, third, treating, i.e. addressing AI risk, and fourth and last, governing AI risk, which includes practical implementation and enforcement tools, as well as monitoring. So first, to define the context and identify risks, we developed a framework to classify AI systems early this year. Maybe go back. I'll just give a really quick overview of that. And in fact, Dewey CSET, several experts from CSET were engaged, and Dewey chaired this group. And this was really answering questions like what's important for policy and risk, in a specific AI system. Is it using personal data? Is it explainable? Does it discriminate? And so on. And then second, building on the framework, we're working on approaches to assess risk in an interoperable way with lots of national and international experts and stakeholders, of which I'll give some examples. And here I think we can emphasize that there really seems to be a window of opportunity right now to seek interoperability ideally ahead of laws and standards being finalized and enacted, because particularly so that we can use the same concepts and terminology as much as possible. Of course, it won't be perfect, but as much as possible so we can decrease the burden on those who will have to implement all of these frameworks. And third, to treat and address risks. Of course, legislation and policy are very important, but organizations also need practical tools, like tools to remove bias or test how secure a system is against attacks. And here we've been building a catalog of tools and metrics for trustworthy AI with partners like NIST and partners from all stakeholder groups, which I'll introduce real quick. And fourth and last, governing AI risk includes implementation and enforcement, as well as monitoring. And so I'll mention a few initiatives we have in that category as well to operationalize some of this risk management work, as well as monitoring risks. So starting with the first defining the risk context, here the starting point is really the many different AI systems do very different things, like Siri on your phone versus a cancer diagnosis system. There's no comparison. And the benefits and challenges for the policymakers need to understand to be able to move the ball forward towards trustworthy AI are just very different. So this framework maps AI technical and business and other characteristics with policy implications and explains those. And this was developed by an expert group, again, co-chaired by our moderator today and launched earlier this year. And it's helpful also practically in because it's actually in use particularly in evaluating medtech applications in the UK and recently in Australia. And so here our goal with this is really to try to bake in international comparability from the start. We've got 5 key dimensions. I won't go through them in any detail, but at the core, people and planet, this really echoes the human-centric orientation of the AI principles. On the left, the context of an AI system, the sector in which it's implemented, how widely it's deployed, and so on. Next, the data and input that flow from the context to the AI model, the AI system itself, including how the data is collected and processed, whether it's personal data, etc. On the right, the model itself, or the system, the core operational logic of the systems and the technologies used in it, i.e., the type and what that means for things like explainability, etc. And the last dimension is really the task and output from the AI model back to the context. And so we've been, as I mentioned, working with partners to operationalize this, but the goal is really to be able to distinguish different systems and have some criteria to do so. So if next, if we move to assessment here, you'll recognize the 4 risk management stages, and so focusing in particular on the assess function. So in this figure, you really see kind of the 3 layers of, let's say, what would be a risk management a framework, with at the top sort of the key high level risk management stages. Then next, those phases, because all of those functions at the top level, you're going to have to conduct at each phase of the AI system lifecycle. So that means that you're going to have to assess risk when you plan and design an AI system, when you collect and process data, when you build and use the model, and so on and so forth. And then the last phase at the bottom is really your objectives. And if you're here what we've used is the OECD AI principles, but you could use, if your objectives are slightly different, you could use those as well. For us, it's really about, for example, transparency and explainability. So this is sort of more of a structure to move through it. And so what we're trying to do with this is really working with experts from lots of organizations that are developing frameworks to assess risks and impacts, including NIST, the Council of Europe, CEN-CINILEC in the EU, IEEE, ISO, among others, and then some national standards bodies as well, and others too. And really what we're trying to do is try to make sure these frameworks are as interoperable as possible. Why? Because at the end of the day, these will only be useful if they are implemented, and it will be very complicated. It could be very complicated for entities that are implementing this to have to implement many different frameworks that are more or less, clearly interoperable. So we're trying to build on that interoperability, and we also think that, for like the EU US Trade and Technology Dialogue and Trade and Technology Council, the OECD, and others are in a good position to help facilitate this interoperability that will really benefit the effectiveness of the implementation, and then potentially enforcement later down the road. So maybe moving on, because I think we're maybe moving on. So the next step is really about, and these are examples, of course, in each of these categories, selected examples, is briefly about treating AI risks. So once you've identified treating, and so here what a project that we think is quite helpful is there are lots of tools out there that are available for reuse, and that can help with specific issues like explainability, like safety, like robustness of AI systems. But it's really hard for individual actors, particularly smaller actors, to sometimes to find the ones that meet their needs, that are that have the right characteristics, that are open source, or that aren't, or not. And so this catalog that will soon be launched really aims to provide a comprehensive repository of key tools to implement trustworthy AI systems, like structured instruments, structured methods that can be leveraged. And so examples include LinkedIn's Fairness Toolkit, Mozilla Open Source Audit Tooling Project, Microsoft's Interpret ML, and there's a lot of tools by large companies, but also a lot by smaller companies. There's a lot of educational tools as well, and by all stakeholders. So this launch is foreseen in March and is joint with NIST, which is also working a lot on the metrics component of this, because each tool is going to be each principle, and achieving that principle is associated with metrics of success or hopefully success. So next, and moving a little bit faster, because I know we to govern AI. So we have seen a significant increase in legislative proposals and laws in many countries, and more interpretation of existing laws for a specific AI use context. That's very important, like for AI in the workplace. But the focus is not only on legislation, and all sorts of policy instruments are being used. As I already mentioned, standards, but we also see a lot of focus on regulatory experimentation, like sandboxes. And yet another critical area of emphasis is corporate governance and sector-specific codes of conduct, like in the US and Singapore. And one avenue that we at the OECD think is promising is applying an existing legal instrument and enforcement mechanism to cover AI principles and AI specificities. And this is the OECD Multinational Enterprise Guidelines and due diligence guidance that could, we think, fairly easily and importantly quickly be applied to responsible business conduct for AI systems, and could be an effective way to help operationalize trustworthy AI in companies of all sizes that operate internationally. You know, so basically this would be about including AI risk management within existing risk management frameworks, as opposed to having, you know, a general risk management function within an enterprise, and then a separate AI ethics or responsible AI component that wouldn't be the same thing and wouldn't relate, because they are strongly related. And this has a number of benefits, this tool at the OECD. And then another, just a last example, I think, of a project that we think is really important is a framework for AI incident reporting. So this is really about making sure that we can compare incidents happening in different jurisdictions, so that we're using one structure, so we can track trends at a global level as opposed to tracking them at a regional or national level, that we can get a big picture of what's, you know, where are risks materializing into actual incidents or not, as the case may be, and then what sectors, what type of what types of issues, is it discrimination, and so on. And it's really important to have that evidence base, I think, to inform policy, and that's something that we've seen a lot of interest in by member countries, and the European Commission and others. And so just to, last slide is just to show you some of the work in parallel to this framework for reporting, which could be compulsory or voluntary reporting, sector specific or general reporting. Is just to have the same a common framework, common definitions. In parallel to that, we're also developing an AI incident monitor that would be automatic, that would be basically tracking in real time global AI media incidents, by tracking all the news in all the world, in all the languages, and identifying AI incidents. So being very interested in AI, we've trained an algorithm to classify news into AI incidents. And here you can see a couple of examples. where this works very well, and the next step here is we're doing that. We're classifying more elements of these incidents, and we're also going to include other sources of publicly available information, like case law, for example, which can give us more information on incidents that have happened, but in addition have been adjudicated. So it's not just it's not just incidents that are alleged. So with that, I'll pass it back to Dewey. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for your overview of OECD and some providing some really interesting insights on how OECD makes a difference in this space. And Karine, thanks for digging in a lot more into the outputs and some of the details about how these principles and a lot of the work is being implemented. That was really interesting. I just wanted to quickly pause and just let everyone know who's online that this is a great time for you to start writing your questions. We're already getting a number of them in chat in your Zoom interface. So if you're on a Zoom browser, you can see our chat function, write those questions there. That's how we're going to be taking questions. We're not taking questions audibly, and also for those that are just calling in on a Zoom number, we won't be able to answer your questions at this point. But let's go ahead and start digging in. There's a lot of interesting questions coming in for both of you, Audrey and Karine. And I wanted to just start at the high level. A lot of interest in how AI principles are truly being implemented. You gave a lot of very good examples, Karine, but I wanted to just go in a little bit more on the accountability principle. And if you could just kind of like summarize how these accountability questions are being addressed in practice, and just to pair that question with a lot of countries are building and adopting principles of their own, or just referencing OECD's. Is there any kind of, in this accountability framing, just saying you've adhered to it, is there any kind of like, evaluation of whether countries are actually adhering to it or actually thinking about actually implementing it in the way that they might say that they're doing in the principles? So those questions are really about the accountability question.
Well, let me take the second part of the question maybe, and then turn back to Karine for the first one on the principle specific. So in terms of evaluating countries against the principles, I would say we generally are in the position as the OECD of assessing, in the sense of we're looking at policies and approaches that align with the principles. We're not generally here to pass judgment or necessarily say somebody's doing something wrong, unless countries ask us to do that for them. And sometimes they do. And I think we see an increasing perhaps demand from countries to assess their approaches against the principles, which is kind of a new and emerging area for us. But let me say that the principles are still fairly new from an OECD perspective. They are going to go through a formal revision process, which is part of the way that we run things here, starting about next year, where we look back at the principles and we say, are they still fit for purpose? Are they keeping up with with changes in the environment? And so I think through that process, we'll probably have some discussions about what might be missing, or if we want to characterize things different, or what has changed since we drafted them back in 2018 and had them adopted in 2019. So we're not a police force, if that's the question, in some sense, but we do try to encourage and sort of provide evidence that helps others draw conclusions about how these are being adopted and implemented. And then Karine, I don't know if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I just fully echo what Audrey said. The OECD really works with the concept of peer pressure, and so what a lot of our work is about comparing countries in terms of qualitatively and quantitatively. So qualitatively in terms of their policies, and quantitatively in terms of their outputs, and that's it might sound like it's, so we're not, as Audrey said, a police for it, and that might sound like it's very soft, but actually it works, and it works in many areas. If you look at the PISA results for education policy, if you look, so it tends to work actually much better than you might have expected, because countries want to look want to do better than other countries, particularly similar sized countries, or the countries that they are usually comparing themselves with. In the area of accountability, here the way we defined accountability in the AI principles was really accountability that AI actors bear for the proper functioning of the systems that they develop and use. And this means that they must ensure their systems are trustworthy. And trustworthy, again, we defined as benefiting people, respecting human rights and fairness, being transparent and explainable, robust, secure, and safe. And so to achieve that, accountable actors need to govern and manage risk throughout the AI systems lifecycle, as we discussed a little bit, from planning and design to data collection and processing to model building and validation, deployment, operation, and monitoring. Now, are we at the point where we can, where any actors can assess accountability? I think it's still underway, but there are many efforts underway to be able to do that, and there's also demand from actors themselves, as well as, it's a push and pull, and also a strong push by policymakers. I'm not sure if that answered the question, though. Might have missed something.
No, that makes sense. And let me just a quick follow-up on this first set of questions. If a country was to come to OECD and say, we'd like, a kind of a assessment of how we're doing, what kind of criteria would you be looking at, or would you naturally go to say, well, these are the things that we would look at first, and how would you, help them get a sense of where they are at relative to other countries? What would be a few examples of the criteria?
Well, we're doing that for 2 countries right now, and there are many criteria. That's actually 130 criteria. So it's a lot of criteria. It's criteria in the space of how their ecosystem compares. What we do usually, the main focus area is really about cross-country comparisons. Obviously comparing countries that are similar, not so that it's meaningful, or but comparing countries amongst each other, but also over time, seeing the trends over time. So that's, and then we'll compare the ecosystem components. So this is more like the skills basis, the research, where they stand in terms of research, where the specializations are, where they're doing very well or less well, and then we'll compare other things like the policies in place. So we'll have many different indicators. I mean, covering just everything from perceptions to it's hard to give one example. There are very many. A number of them are actually on the OECD AI Policy Observatory. So there's a trends in data section, which has a lot of interactive functionalities, and then we're adding a whole bunch more on there.
I think one example might be, just because I'm also trying to monitor the chat, is that we might look at a change in demand for certain kinds of skills in AI over time by country. And so we do that by getting access. We have access to different types of databases, and so we can analyze that on a country level. So we could say, country A, there's like the skills are changing, the demand for skills in machine learning has gone way up, and then you could look at, okay, is there a lot of VC investment going into AI? Is there a lot of research happening, and where's that collaboration going on across countries? And so a big, as Karine says, a big value proposition is that it's not that we don't sometimes look at micro or firm level data, but countries really like to compare themselves so that they can learn from each other, and it's a big reason they come to the OECD. But that's a couple of examples.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh,
and then in addition, so this is just building on what Audrey said. So that's on the economic side, but then on the trustworthy AI side, there's also like, what's the education offering in terms of courses for ethical AI. So we'll do that kind of analysis, and how many folks are following those courses for a given country, and we'll have those skill sets, and what's the demand in the job postings, for those kinds of sort of softer skills, or or more ethical, responsible AI-oriented skills. If we're talking about, the less straightforward skills, there are a lot of questions.
Yeah, no, let me jump into another one. So there's been a few questions coming in, and I'm bundling questions. So thank you everyone for continuing to put in these the questions are coming in. So when OECD, obviously you have member countries and then you have adherent countries you've mentioned. What do you perceive your role as for non-member countries? These could be countries such as Africa, or not the ones who are or global South in general, or maybe even Russia or China, who have interesting activities going on in AI. And I'm just trying to get a sense of, like, how do you see yourself in this international concept space beyond just the members, and what role are you seeing yourself playing, and particularly in AI governance, just to be very clear?
Yeah, so I think we see our role as multifold. One is as a convener and bringing a diverse set of conversations from a diverse set of points of view to the table. And so while the sort of day-to-day work and the agreement on outputs and things like recommendations go through our committee, which is comprised of members in the European Union and stakeholders, at the end of the day, we value very much a broader conversation. And so particularly in AI, a technology, and most technology that is inherently global. And our objective is to, as Karine said, make things as interoperable as possible from a policy perspective, which means we need to engage as much as we can. That said, of course, we have to prioritize like everybody else. We have limited resources and limited time. And so it tends to be that we have different ways of engaging with countries. So they can participate in experts groups, non-members, and we have a lot of non-members participating in our AI work. In some cases, non-member countries have specific agreements with the OECD to work with us in more in-depth ways. And that really spans the globe. It's not necessarily specific to a particular region. So we have, work in Southeast Asia. We have work in Africa. We have work in South America, and we have really members across the globe. But I think, on the topic of, I'll just say that, except for Russia, that's the one country we no longer we can no longer work with. Since the war last year, but other than that, we do try, particularly on the data level, where we're gathering data, we're trying to understand trends, because for our member countries, if they have big holes in their understanding of what's happening, it doesn't help them know how they're really doing. So we try to engage as much as possible. Of course, the geopolitics around this issue is touchy and difficult, and so there are some tough conversations happening around some different governmental approaches to AI. But we generally go with the spirit of curiosity and engagement, and then of course the decision making and what the OECD adopts itself is really left to its members.
No, that makes sense. So another topic that is of interest is obviously AI is in the news with some very interesting releases from Chat GPT and a variety of other things that have really caught the imagination of not just government officials, but now individuals and just the general populace. So now that this attention is continuing to go up, do you interact with the general public at all, or is any of your engagements with the government or the member states asking for thoughts about people who are their own citizens, who are very concerned or maybe even terrified in some case about where things are going and how things are changing, and some of these new tools? I'm just curious if just briefly, if there's anything you would say to the general public in this space, or how you would deal with that.
So the OECD is an intergovernmental organization. So our members are primarily the member states, and so they have their own dialogue with citizens in their countries. So that needs to be said. On the other hand, what we do is work with them on many indicators, for example, analyzing sentiment analysis and things like that. We also have a lot of, well, we try, or by, let's say, by intergovernmental standards, we're not too bad, but by some other standards, maybe we're dinosaurs. But we try to engage with via blog posts and social media, like LinkedIn in particular, where we'll ask questions. And actually, interestingly enough, on issues related to generative AI and ChatGPT, this turned out to be, we had a ministerial meeting on the digital economy policy in December in Spain, and that actually, it was 3 weeks after the launch of ChatGPT, and that turned out to be the sort of I'd say the surprise, the realization moment. There was nothing really new, except that suddenly it was very clear to policymakers, oh, this is what these tools can do. Wow. And it was, just very, it was a moment of realization. It wasn't that it wasn't as it hadn't hit them necessarily so clearly before. And so that's, I think, just the beginning. We also operate the Global Parliamentary Network, which is which is a very large group of parliamentarians around the world who also interact very closely with citizens around the world. And this is much, much broader than the OECD. I forget how many countries participate, but I think it's over 100 easily. And so what we usually do is meet with them as well. And that's also sort of a little bit indirect way to citizens, but that's another way that we gather information, and it goes both ways. And on important projects like the classification framework, we'll have public consultations.
Let me just add to that by saying we do have a part of our team focused on consumer policy, where we do look at individuals. What we don't usually have citizens coming to the meetings or anything like that, but we do everything is kind of focused on the person and the individual at the end of the day and their experience. I think overall our goal is to kind of reduce the fear factor by putting evidence behind what's happening, and not to diminish the challenges or the risks there, and not to overpromise the possibilities, but to put a rational conversation that dampens down a bit the hysteria and puts it with good evidence and reasons and facts to do that. And I think by helping get that message to governments, it also hopefully helps trickle down to the populace.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you so much. I want to note that we have 5 minutes left. We might go a few minutes over for those who are able to stay, because there's just so many more questions, and even then we won't be able to get to all of them. 2 points I wanted to come back to that come up that are a lot of the questions, and you also mentioned them. And one is the combination of standards and due diligence in helping the corporate world, and then the other one is in the space of AI instance database and the risk work that you've been working on. So let me come back to the first one. Standards are really essential to interoperability and to making systems work effectively. So there's a question about what are you doing in the standard space, and particularly when you think about the values-based principles for AI and the safeguards that need to be built. And there's it's hard to build this in the software. It's hard to make sure that you've done the due diligence. Sometimes you need external views of what's going on to make sure it's being done well. And I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit more about the due diligence work you're doing with the corporate world to help understand how you are helping move forward these principles into action, where code actually, rubber hits the road and people are actually interfacing with the tools that are being built.
Sure. I think maybe just a point of clarification, Dewey, standards for us don't necessarily mean technical standards, and actually many of the standards, we call them standards, but they are not technical standards necessarily. They might have technical components, but they're oftentimes process standards or policy standards. But they wouldn't be hardcore technical standards. That's ISO, that's IEEE, that's the real technical standardization body. So we're not a standardization body in that sense at all. What we are is, I think we could actually call ourselves an interoperability body, and the idea here and our mission actually is to bring together the policies and bring together and try to find those commonalities, and where we can, of course we can't always, but identify wherever we can the commonalities and the agreements, build consensus where it's possible and push for that. So that's what we try to do, and this includes in areas that are process standards. For example, we mentioned some of the risk management frameworks. So this is one of those. And then, and so in terms of due diligence, this is the same thing. So the due diligence tools and framework of the OECD is a lot around process. It's what do you need to do, basically? What are governments asking enterprises that are operating internationally to do in terms of processes to make sure that they're considering human rights implications, labor implications of the practices and their supply chains and so on, minerals purchases and all of that. And so this is very similar. It's asking companies to consider those impacts of using AI systems and document them. And so this, again, part of it might be technical, but again, we wouldn't be developing the technical because we're not engineers, we're not computer scientists, but we would be bringing that together and trying to generate that consensus along with the technical groups. So I don't know if that's helpful in terms of interoperability.
I think we also have this role of pointing out where things are not working and where things need to be standardized, and pushing governments to engage in that process and stakeholders to engage in that process. And even if we aren't the ones to do it, we often see where things are diverging, and we can, even if the conversation isn't at the OECD, that's I will just take the opportunity, Dewey, to say, like, I see a lot of questions about how do you work with the standards bodies and all that stuff, and I can say that we do. Like, we work with them, we're in touch with them, we attend some of their work, we leverage their work, they try to leverage our work. As you know, we've got people from IEEE and other groups involved in our work on AI. We've got significant industry participation. There was a question earlier about do you this is technical stuff. Do you get technical people? I think you're exhibit A of that, Dewey, but there's a few exhibits behind you that I think, go to that. So I think that's the short answer there is yes. And in particular on AI, I think we've really corralled the universe to because we can, if you look at the world of cybersecurity, you look at the world of privacy, we're trying to learn from the things that don't to this day interoperate well, and get ahead of some of that in the AI space, learn from the breakdown, and get ahead of some of these regulations and laws coming out to try to not preempt in a telling people what to do way, but try to anticipate the implementation challenges and get people talking from the same page, even if all the different IOs and the Council of Europe and the EU and everybody's going to have their own sort of flavor. If it's largely based on the same concepts, the same frameworks, we hope that we'll have a better outcome for AI than maybe we've had in some other areas.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So it feels like 100 questions have come in, and I'm so sorry that we're only barely scraping the top of so many fascinating questions, dealing with a variety of aspects of implementation to the incident database that you guys mentioned. So it's really quite exciting to hear this. So I'm going to just end, sadly, with a broad question of like, so the audience that's on the webinar now is from all over the world, but a lot of people are in the DC area. And I just was curious if, as you're thinking about the priorities that you're implementing in the near future, and as you're continuing to move forward these AI related issues, what do you think this audience might miss about the international AI landscape that you think we really ought to be aware of, or priorities that we need to like maybe up in our consciousness? And it can be very personal. I'm just curious what you think we should know about AI policy and governance in the multinational and multi-party environment.
Okay, so I'll just throw a couple things out there. They're not connected ideas. So I think somebody mentioned Chat GPT in the chat. So I'll just take the minute to say that I think governments are just starting to get their head around the implication for things like mis and disinformation around and the implications of AI there. And I think we have so many challenges already with mis and dis that adding the AI layer is something that we're thinking about, and I know lots are thinking about, but I think it's a big area. The other area is compute, and this, Dewey, but it's long been a sort of fascination of Karine's, and of course my background leads me to gravitate toward it. But sort of thinking, helping countries understand computing capacity needs as they build AI in order to leverage it for good, for looking at modeling climate change and modeling all kinds of things that need to happen. And so thinking about those resources that are not just software and skills, but other resources that have sort of maybe traditionally been overlooked in favor of some of the more maybe more accessible aspects of AI. Those are just a couple of things on our radar. Karine probably has others.
I think those are important ones. The other one I would add is the sort of medium term. I mean, that's related, obviously, the medium term and long term implications of how fast and the speed at which the AI developments are happening and what that means for policy and keeping pace, keeping up with, which is impossible basically for many policymakers. And how do we find mechanisms, experimental mechanisms, policy experimentation, things like that can help bring policymakers along the journey of new, so that they're not afraid, but also that we have the appropriate safeguards in place. And so I think that's one of them. And then really one of the priorities moving forward, moving forward is really moving more on the foresight work. And what does this mean? Because it seems to be the pace has been very rapid, but it seems to be accelerating tremendously. Maybe this is just an impression, but it's an impression that is felt by many. And so that is something that I think that many need to focus on. It's going to be a big global effort of all stakeholders.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I'll just want to add also, I'm really excited about your work with the AI instance work. I know you've already talked about it, but I think that a lot of times we all have our theories about what will be dangerous with AI, what will be scary with AI, but we often don't actually know what is really happening. And being able to actually track with in a multi-country environment where the issues are actually coming up, where hazards are being seen, will help inform our risk management and our risk thinking a lot. And I'm really excited about your leadership in this effort. I'm really impressed with what you're pulling together and just adding to the list of priorities that you've already mentioned. I also heard, we saw some questions about resources for people who are interested in understanding, a gentle introduction to artificial intelligence. I think there are some interesting books that that CSET staff might throw in the links here. There's The New Fire: War, Peace, and Democracy in the Age of AI. That has an intersection of the security as well as the AI introduction by Ben Buchanan and Andrew Embry. There's a interesting paper published quite some time ago, but it still provides a really good introduction by Ben Buchanan from the Balfour Center. We'll probably throw that link in there as we end. But once again, thank you so much, Audrey and Karine, for taking time out of your day to tell us a little bit more. There was a lot of interest, a lot of participation on the panel. Questions for the panel, as well as a lot of people joining in. So thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it over to Lynn.
Thank you too very much.
Merci bien to everyone. I'd like to thank our speakers, especially Audrey Plonk and Karine Perset of the OECD, together with CSET Executive Director Dewey Murdick for moderating today's program. And thank you all too for taking part in our discussion, for your comments and questions, and we are really sorry we couldn't get to them all. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to cset.georgetown.edu and sign up for our newsletter and research updates. Our next event will take place on February 16th and will feature CSET researchers Emily Weinstein and Nora Long, together with Emily Kilcrease of CNAS, discussing the national security implications of capital flows from the United States into China's tech sector. It will be based on a soon-to-be-published CSET paper that evaluates the size, frequency, and nature of US investment in Chinese AI companies. Watch your inbox for the invite for this webinar, which we are calling Turn Off the Tap. Thank you again for joining us, and we do hope to see you soon.